Hello, I'm James Beebe, your instructor for the graduate seminar Relativism and Anti-Realism in Philosophy at the University at Buffalo. I have created this supplemental lecture to explain some things about relativist approaches to ethics, epistemology, and beyond, because there are important features, important things to understand about relativism that are not explicitly represented in any of our reading assignments for this semester, but that will help you understand what's the broader argumentative context, what's really going on when people put forward these forms of relativism. An important reason I wanted to do this is because philosophers are often brought up thinking that any form of relativism must be false because it's a form of relativism. So I wanted to show you that actually some forms of relativism are exceedingly plausible in some domains outside of ethics and epistemology, and you might not even know or be familiar with these kinds of relativism. So I want to briefly explain them to you and then show how the versions of relativism in ethics and epistemology that we are considering look just like them. And so if the first kind look plausible, well then maybe the second group, the epistemology and ethics group, could look plausible as well. I'm also going to, well, throughout this discussion, I'm going to focus on norms of good interpretation. When we're interpreting the words and actions of others, there's more or less charitable ways to interpret them, more or less accurate ways to interpret them. And I want to talk about some norms of interpretation, and then again I'm going to suggest that, or argue that, relativism oftentimes does a better job of following these norms of good interpretation than various invariantist views, which I'm going to discuss in this presentation. So the upshot is I'm going to try to make relativism look less unfamiliar than I think it might very well look to some of you. And as I said, this will also be a kind of argument in favor of relativism, but it'll help you understand the larger picture, the larger argumentative philosophical context of the debate. So let's jump right in. I first of all want to begin with considering interpretations from the history of philosophy. So here's a fictional example. Suppose that there are some passages in Aristotle's metaphysics that seem to contradict each other. And I'm just making this up. I don't actually have any passages in mind. But this kind of thing happens in the history of philosophy, especially with difficult thinkers, especially with ancient thinkers, or especially with thinkers where we don't even have original manuscripts. We have maybe even their students' notes. But in any case, suppose that there's this passage, or there's this statement in Metaphysics Gamma, where Aristotle says this one thing, but there's this other passage in Metaphysics Delta where he says this other thing, and they seem to be contradicting each other. And furthermore, suppose that there's other passages like this throughout the works of Aristotle. In Metaphysics Theta, there's a passage that seems to directly contradict something that he states fairly straightforward in De Anima. And similarly for something he says in the categories and something he says in the topics. Now suppose that, here's what one ancient scholar says about all these passages. His interpretation is, well, on the surface, it looks like Aristotle is contradicting himself in these various places. And my interpretation is that this is not just on the surface, that in fact, deep down, he is contradicting himself. And now suppose that there is this other ancient scholar, scholar number 2, who says, on my interpretation, which involves not just looking at the individual statements themselves, but paying careful attention to the broader passages in which these statements are found, and the broader argumentative or philosophical context in which they appear, when you pay careful attention to the broader context, you'll see that although Aristotle is indeed using similar words in these various places, he's actually talking about different things. His focus is on something else. And so when you understand what he's saying in this way, you will see that he's not actually contradicting himself. Now let's think about how the broader community of scholars who work on ancient philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, will view these interpretations. I hope that you have the immediate intuition that surely the community of scholars is going to be antecedently, or whatever it is, intuitively drawn to the interpretation of Scholar 2. Now, they're not just going to go along with any old interpretation of Aristotle on which Aristotle is consistent. You know, Scholar 2 has got to actually offer a reasonable, plausible interpretation of the passages, paying a careful attention to what the various Greek terms mean, how Aristotle has used those same Greek terms in other places, how much he seems to vary the meaning of those terms in these places. So scholar number 2 has got to provide solid textual evidence. Nevertheless, it is the case that scholars in the history of philosophy are, other things being equal, going to prefer an interpretation of Aristotle on which he does not contradict himself to one on which he does. So this symbol here is a decision from decision theory, and it represents preference. So the second statement is preferred to the first. If that symbol had been facing the other way, it would be saying that the first statement would be preferred to the second, and it's fashioned after the less than symbol. So think about how with a less than symbol, whatever quantity appears on the left of the less than symbol is smaller quantity, and whatever appears on the right represents a greater quantity. And there's something like that here with the preference symbol. Whatever's on the left is preferred to a lesser degree. And this preference isn't just a subjective preference amongst scholars in the history of philosophy. It's not just like my preference for dark chocolate over milk chocolate. It's a preference that we think is connected to truth. It's grounded in and related to accuracy. So we have this preference because we actually think it's more probable that Aristotle doesn't contradict himself than that he does, that it's an interpretation on which he does not contradict himself is more likely to be true, more likely to be accurate than the other kind. Okay, so that's a little bit from the history of philosophy. I'm going to explain some other bits, and then I'm going to use each of these bits to mount an argument on behalf of relativist philosophy, as I suggested earlier, on which I maintain that the relativist follows good norms of interpretation better than their invariantist competitors much of the time. So here's another instance that I want to consider that involves norms of interpretation. So instead of history of philosophy, this is going to be anthropology. And surprise, surprise, once upon a time, there was this colonial aristocrat who gave an uncharitable interpretation of some Africans. Hard to believe, I know. But here goes. So this fella, Evans Pritchard, sitting in the chair, is an anthropologist. And he is known for interpreting the Azande people who are surrounding him. Particularly in this book, concerning their views about witchcraft, magic. Okay? Now this book and Evans Pritchard's work are discussed in our text from Maria Bagramian and Annalisa Koleva on relativism, and it's discussed in one or more of the Stanford Encyclopedia articles on relativism and moral relativism. So here's what Evans Pritchard has to say. The Azande, and sometimes that's spelled without the initial A, the Azande, he says, reject basic logic. They reject the principle of non-contradiction, the most basic, most obvious principle of logic there has ever been. That's Evans Pritchard. Okay? So here's Bagramian and Koleva. And I believe this passage appeared in one of our required reading assignments. I think it actually came from the chapter on moral relativism. Okay, so the Azande, according to Evans Pritchard, govern their daily lives based on the belief that illness, injury, and other misfortunes are the result of witchcraft, that there are witches among them who are the instigators of such misfortune. Okay? Now, here's where we get to the Evans Pritchard's conclusion that these people are irrational for rejecting basic logic. So, witches cause misfortune, they think. Now, being a witch, witchhood, is something that you don't learn by apprenticing yourself to a witch. Rather, it's something that's inherited biologically, and it's inherited on the father side, patrilineally. Doesn't matter who your mother, well, sorry, let's just stick with sons, at least. For sons, it's inherited patrilineally. A son can't become a witch because of something passed on from his mother. Okay? If he's gonna be a witch, it's because of something passed on from his father. So witchhood inherited patrilineally, at least for sons. Now, Igazandi clans are organized patrilineally. So what clan you belong to is determined by who your father was and who your father's father was and father's fathers and so on. That's how they organize things. Okay? Now, think about what all this means. So if some male is a witch, and he's in a clan, because everybody's in a clan, and witchhood is inherited patrilineally, clans are organized patrilineally, well then this guy must pass down witchhood to all of his sons and grandsons. So all of his male ancestors must be witches, but the Azande said, no, that's not true. They're not all witches. Evans Pritchard says, look, bro, look at the statements here. Witchhood inherited patrilineally. Clan members related patrilineally. Dude in a certain clan is a witch. All the other male descendants of that guy must be witches. You say no, you contradict basic logic. Okay, so that's Evans Pritchard. Now here's the thing, here's the rub. So Maria Bagramian and Annalisa Koleva, when they mention this passage in the text that we started our semester with on relativism, they never once raise any questions about the accuracy of Evans Pritchard's interpretation, nor does the Stanford Encyclopedia article on relativism, nor do many other people. They just think, they just accept what this guy has to say as totally accurate. And I don't buy it. I don't buy it one bit. There's a variety of reasons why I don't buy it. I think it's, as I'll explain, I think it's a lot more likely that he simply misinterpreted them than that they really do reject what appears to be the most basic law of all logic. I first of all would like to note that, however, we think that things can be inherited patrilineally in modern genetics without every male descendant inheriting the trait in question. I'm not saying the Azande had anything, they obviously didn't have anything like modern genetics in mind, but here's what modern genetics says. So Y chromosomes, those can only be passed on by male parents. Can't get one from a mother. Let's leave intersex folk to the side. So that means Y chromosomes can only be inherited patrilineally. Well, there are some genes that are found only on Y chromosomes, which are inherited patrilineally. And these genes are necessary for certain phenotypes to be displayed in the organisms that have these genes. Here's the thing, though. You can have these genes passed on to you patrilineally as a male if you have a Y chromosome, leaving aside intersex folks. There's these genes that you can have. There are 4 traits that are passed on patrilineally that are sort of key to these traits, but yet you may not manifest the trait. Other genes have to cooperate in order for that trait to be manifest, and those other genes may not be in place or may not cooperate in the right ways. It's also the case that the Y chromosome has lost most of the original genes that it's had. I didn't do the percentage. I mean, perhaps could have done that. That's what, I don't know, 90% of the genes originally on the Y chromosome are just sort of gone over the course of its existence. So there can be a gene on the Y chromosome, i.e. a gene inherited only patrilineally, but there can be various kinds of mistakes in the passing on of these traits, such that not all of some male's descendants will have the gene for that trait. The Y chromosome is particularly exposed to high mutation rates. Okay, so in any case, we look at ourselves. We actually, modern genetics tells us to believe actually some rather similar things. There's traits that can be passed on patrilineally, not always displayed. Anyway. But regardless of what modern genetics does or does not say about the Y chromosome and patrilineal inheritance of phenotype and genotype, man, I just find it. Look at these probabilities. Think about how probable it really is that there's a group of humans that don't accept the very most basic thing out of all of logic to accept. Think about what that probability is. And now think about this other probability value. The probability that some arrogant Oxbridge colonialist anthropologist did not charitably and accurately interpret what these folks were saying. I mean, seriously, ask yourself. Don't forget what my estimation of these 2 probability values is. Ask yourself. I don't think there's any way that that first probability value can be any higher than the second. I think there's no way. And so I'm just astounded when Maria Bagramian and these other folks just sort of take this guy at his word, as if he's got to be understood as being totally accurate. Okay? So again, this is like the case of history of philosophy concerning the case of Aristotle that I mentioned that I discussed just a moment ago. I'm going to use cases like this in just a moment to mount an argument on behalf of some kinds of relativist interpretations of human words and other behaviors. And I'm going to argue that there are important norms of interpretation that the relativist argues. And in fact, I'm going to argue that the invariantist looks a lot like Evans Pritchard and the first Aristotelian scholar. So I want to put another example on the table before I make my argument about relativism in ethics and epistemology. So this is going to be another anthropological case, and again, we're supposed to imagine something colonialist going on. So white Western anthropologists go into non-white, non-Western culture and describing what they see there. Okay, so Colonial anthropologist says, I have traveled to a far-off land. I have great tales to tell about the exotic people there. I do not, FYI, I don't endorse his use of the term exotic here, but you know, people who look like Evans Pritchard are going to say things like that. Now, because I had no translation manual to assist my learning of the local language, I just had to pay careful attention. I had to observe the circumstances in which they used various sounds, and then I had to infer which of these various sound bits were words and infer what these words corresponded to, what they denoted. Okay, so I have determined that the local word gavagai means rabbit. I've also determined that the locals almost always use the word gavagai incorrectly. They apply this word to any four-legged animal that walks by. But like I said, I have determined from my careful observation of their behavior that it should only be used to refer to rabbits, and yet they constantly use it to refer to any four-legged animal. And again, imagine the colonialist anthropologist shaking his head and saying, these primitive folks sure are primitive. They can't even speak their own language properly. I mean, they definitely don't deserve self-rule. They should continue to be ruled by the British Empire, obviously. They can't even talk properly. Now, as I hope will be clear, surely it's obvious, surely we can all agree that this guy must have interpreted their word incorrectly, right? So consider those two probability values at the bottom. What's the probability that they almost always use a word in their language incorrectly? Basically every time, more than 99% of the time, they are using a word of their own language that they invented to have the meaning that it does, to have the practical utility that it does in their lives. They use it to utter falsehoods 99% of the time. They say, that's a rabbit. It's not a rabbit. It's a four-legged animal that's not a rabbit. How probable is that really? And then consider the second probability value, the probability that our second colonial anthropologist has misinterpreted them. I mean, I told the story in such a way that it should be obvious that the word means four-legged animal, right? Okay. So again, back to the two statements at the top that are conjoined with the preference symbol. I suggest that the second interpretation should be preferred to the first. It's more charitable and more likely to be accurate. Charitable in the sense of respecting. There's a moral component to charity and an epistemic component to charity. The sort of moral component to charity and interpretation is you give these people respect. The same respect you would accord to a fellow Oxbridge Don. You don't jump to the conclusion that, oh, they're non-Western, non-industrialized, non-white. They must be, insert negative term of that evaluation. So that's the moral component. I think the second interpretation is going to be superior on ethical grounds. But I also think it's going to be superior on epistemic grounds, truth-related grounds. It's more likely just to be an accurate report of the facts, the actual linguistic behavior. Now I want to transition from these anthropological and history of philosophy cases to cases where philosophers are articulating various philosophical views. And in each case, there's going to be someone who's going to be analogous to the colonialist, and then there's going to be someone analogous to the person given the superior interpretation. So, a skeptic comes along, a radical skeptic about knowledge of the external world. And in all following slides, I will be concerned only with knowledge of the external world, not knowledge of the internal world, not a priori knowledge. So, a posteriori knowledge of contingent propositions of the world external to your mind. That's what I'm concerned with, because that's the way skepticism is usually talked about. Okay, so the skeptic says, I have completed a careful analysis of the truth conditions of knows. Those are the conditions under which statements containing knows are true. What does it take for them to be true? So I have completed such an analysis, and I have determined that this word is almost always used incorrectly by modern English speakers. Almost every time people attribute knowledge, they say something false. The very rare occasions where they attribute knowledge and say something true, they're actually talking about interior knowledge, knowledge by introspection. When they just talk about they know how things seem. But as soon as they start talking about knowing how things are in the external world, well, they say something false every time. Okay? So that's the radical skeptic. By the way, I'm not trying to suggest that this is the primary or only way that the skeptic argues for their position. Very often, skepticism is argued for in a very different way. Here we have someone doing something like anthropological semantics or something like that, descriptive semantics. They're observing linguistic behavior and then drawing a conclusion about the meanings of moral terms from their observations. Very often, skepticism is argued for in a different kind of way. But I'm just imagining a skeptic that's like this. This kind of skeptic is actually gets talked about a good bit in the epistemology literature. Now, what I would like to suggest is that the interpretation of knows offered by the radical skeptic looks a good bit like the interpretation of Gavagai offered by the colonial anthropologists a few slides ago. They look around, they look at a term that's used by native speakers, and they say, I have determined that in almost every case where it's used to say something that's false. And what I would like to suggest is, think about how obviously wrong the colonial anthropologists seemed a few slides ago when we were dealing with Gavagai. It just seemed obviously wrong. I would like for you to import those feelings, those cognitive, intuitive feelings over here into this case. I mean, if such an interpretation on which the native speakers are always using a word incorrectly seems to be a bad interpretation of linguistic usage, well, it seems like it should seem like a bad interpretation here as well. And that's what a variety of non-skeptics would like to argue. They say that they argue that the skeptic has come across an interpretation of knows that's simply not the right interpretation of the ordinary term knows. It fails to correspond to the ordinary concept of knowledge. On the ordinary concept of knowledge, we know it's true that we know a lot of things about the external world. And just like the Gavagai interpreter, his interpretation seems wildly skewed. It should be a word whose meaning is any four-legged animal, and somehow he got rabbit out of that, which is a four-legged animal, but it's only one of many. It's a tiny subset of the overall set of four-legged animals, and something like that is happening with the radical skeptic. the definition these people came up with is just a skewed thing. I now want to discuss two other examples that involve comparing different interpretations of the meaning of some term. And in these cases, there's going to be an invariantist interpretation and a relativist interpretation or contextualist interpretation of the term. The first concerns the gradable adjective flat. And this is drawn upon the work of Peter Unger. And it's the work of Peter Unger on flat and knowledge that Keith DeRose tells us he first reflected on in order to develop his own contextualism. So towards the end of our reading assignment for Keith DeRose, he talked about the gradable adjective tall. Similar considerations are going to apply. So let's talk about what Peter Unger once said about flat. So imagine that there's some ultimate Frisbee team that's walking around the UB North campus after everyone's been vaccinated and the pandemic is over, and they're looking for a grassy field to play Frisbee in. They look at some field and they say, one person says, that field is flat. And the others look at it and say, oh yeah, that's flat. Okay, let's go play. All right. Imagine another case. A student needs to take a test. They need a flat surface to write on. And they enter a room, and for some reason, many of the tables in those rooms are quite bumpy. Now, I know that's unusual, but just play along. In this story, many of the tables in this room are quite bumpy. Maybe it's in the Center for the Arts, and these are art students making artsy tables, doing funky things to them. And tables and desks. And after looking around the room, a student sees one that doesn't have all the funky bumps on it and says, oh, this desk is flat. I'll take my test here. Now imagine a scientist in a laboratory setting working with superconducting film and looking at the superconducting film with a pretty high resolution microscope says, this superconducting film is flat. Those over there are not flat, but this one is, so we can sell this to our customers. Okay? Now, in each case, we have these people thinking about different things when they're talking about flatness, right? How flat a field needs to be in order to play ultimate Frisbee on and not sort of twist an ankle or have it be, a workable field is one thing, and that's something that's very different from how flat something needs to be in order for you to write on it to take a test. Something needs to be more flat to take a test on it, right? But of course, a variety of desks or tables can be flat enough for taking a test and not flat enough for superconducting purposes. For certain kinds of scientific purposes, you've got to be able to zoom in to a very fine level of detail and still see flatness. Okay? Now, here's what Peter Unger says about each of these cases. Every one of these assertions is false. When the Frisbee team says that field is flat, the student says that desk is flat, this superconducting film is flat. Everybody's assertion of flat that they ever make is false, Peter Unger says. Now, it's of course warranted for them to say this. They satisfy all the epistemic conditions for making assertions. So it's epistemically permissible for them to say each of these things. So epistemically warranted assertions were made in each of these three cases. False assertions were made in each of these three cases, but epistemically warranted. So epistemic conditions are not the only ones on warranted on assertability. You can be epistemically warranted in making a statement, but it might violate norms of politeness. Okay, so it could satisfy epistemic norms. You have enough evidence to be able to assert it, but it would be quite rude, so keep your mouth shut. Or it could be immoral to assert for some reason. Maybe you promised, if you promised not to tell someone some secret, well then asserting it would be breaking a promise. So there's something ethically or morally bad about that. Even if, evidentially, epistemically, you would have satisfied everything you need to satisfy in order to be in a position epistemically to assert it. So anyways, what Peter Unger says is, epistemically, these are warranted assertions that are all false. So he's an invariantist, a very strict invariantist, about flatness. I guess I should have written flatness there. But a relativist about the assertability of each of these statements. Now, the reason why he says each of these statements is concerning flatness is false is because flat means no bumps, no curves, no deviations from absolute flatness, no deviations from the absolute absence of bumps and curves. And even in the superconducting case, well, you zoom in enough with your microscope, you will see some bumps or curves. Okay, Unger says, then the superconducting film is not in fact flat. Now here's the thing about Unger. He does not take himself to be defining a technical sense, a technical term, flat, a technical sense. He takes himself to be defining the ordinary English word flat. The ordinary English word flat is this extreme and strict concerning the absolute absence of bumps and curves, he says. And accordingly, basically everyone who uses the word flat is false. So Unger is like the Gavagai anthropologist. If you want to define a technical term that's more strict than an ordinary term, that's cool. Knock yourself out, cool, go for it. But that's not what Peter Unger takes himself to be doing. He says he is offering an interpretation of the meaning of the ordinary word flat. And it just doesn't seem plausible. It seems pretty far-fetched. So contextualism, or a relativist interpretation of flat, is going to go like this. The meaning of flat is going to vary across contexts of use. The thing that's common across all those contexts is this. Assertions of flat across, or attributions of flatness across contexts, all have in common that the person is saying the surface in question, the field, the table, the film, these are close enough to absolute flatness for present purposes. That's the thing that's constant across context. But the thing that varies across context is how close to absolute flatness the surface needs to be in order to truly and accurately count as flat. So according to contextualism, the Frisbee team, the test-taking student, and the scientist all said something true. That field is flat. That desk is indeed flat. This film is indeed flat. Each of them said something true. But the meaning of flat in each case is different. There's a commonality across cases. There's the part that's common and there's the part that's variable. It's a half variable, half constant. Kaplan's semantics, from which all this is derived, calls the one part the character, the other part the content of it, like of an indexical. It's half and half. But in any case, according to invariantism, all those assertions are false. And that seems like a pretty implausible view. So to the degree that contextualism has people saying true things a lot more often, I would like to argue that's a reason for thinking contextualism or relativism isn't this exotic, weird, aberrant, deviant sort of thing that must be rejected, but it's in fact quite plausible. Contextualism here is like the person who says, well, you know, the native meant four-legged animal by Gavagai. And the invariantist is like the anthropologist who says the native meant, the local meant rabbit by Gavagai, and then went on to use it falsely, basically all the time. If we think the one anthropologist is stupidly misguided and the other anthropologist is more on the right track, well, there's a kind of argument from that to an argument in favor of contextualism. They have people, contextualists, or relativist semantics has people saying true things in a quite sensible way, far more often. So when it comes to flatness, I would like to argue that flatness, relativism about flatness is the right thing to do. The domain of things that count as flat will shift across contexts. In some domain, in some context, a broader domain, a narrower domain, a different domain will count as flat. So that means the meaning of flat varies. So regardless of what you think about relativism and ethics and epistemology, seems like it's the right view to, I would like to suggest it's the right view to take here. Let's consider another case that's structurally similar. This concerns the phenomenon of quantifier domain restriction. So if you ever wanted to read more about it, that would be the term to use. So suppose at the beginning of one of our Friday Zoom meetings, I look around and I see 8 people's faces on the Zoom meeting, myself and 7 others. There are 7 people registered for our course, by the way. Plus me makes 8. I look around and I see 8 faces. I say, everyone is here, let's get started. Did I say something true when I say everyone is here? Well, there is an invariantist interpretation of everyone on which I said something false and on which everyone says something false every time they use the word everyone. See, the invariantist says everyone means everyone. When I looked around and I said everyone is here, was the Pope there? No. Was Chuck Norris there? Queen Bee? The Hoff? Nope. All right then, not everyone was there. So I in fact said something false. This is a view that's actually seriously defended. And for some reason, a number of years ago, I had the impression that our own David Brown endorsed this view. So last Thursday, I actually started to compose an email to him to ask him. I can't remember why I thought he might endorse this view. But I wound up not sending the email. I don't know if he actually endorses this view, but some people actually endorse this view concerning the meaning of everyone. It means everyone. And it's an invariantist interpretation of everyone. Now, to explain how it's an invariantist interpretation and to explain how a relativist interpretation of everyone should be seen as superior, I just want to ward off one thing. You may be thinking to yourself, look, sure, I uttered assertively the sentence, everyone is here, but we all know that what I meant was, everyone registered for this course is here. And in order for that sentence, everyone registered for this course is here, to be true, it's not the case that the Pope needs to be here. He's not registered for this course. Here, the quantifier, every, ranges over all persons registered for this course. And everyone who's in fact registered was here, so everything's good. And this should come out as true. So you may be familiar from the philosophy of language of a distinction between speaker meaning and sentence meaning. And it is true that as a speaker, that's what I had in mind. And that's what you were going to take me to have in mind. And it's what you're going to have in mind when I utter that sentence. Okay? And there's no puzzle about how to interpret everyone registered for this course is here. There's no puzzle about that. Nevertheless, there is a puzzle about how to interpret the sentence, everyone is here. I didn't actually say everyone registered for this course is here. I assertively uttered the sentence, everyone is here. And even if my speaker meaning is equivalent to everyone registered for this course is here, I want to ask, what is the literal meaning of the sentence? And there are people who think that the literal meaning of the sentence, everyone is here, is such that the universal quantifier, ranges over every person, including the Pope, Queen Bee, and so on. And I think that's quite implausible. I think the sentence that I said is true. I could have said everyone registered for this course is here, and that would be true. But I didn't. I said everyone is here, and it's not a problem that that's what I said, and that sentence is in fact true. Everyone was there. Now, let a bare everyone statement be the kind of statement where I just say everyone is X. Everyone is here, everyone is tall, everyone is hungry. A use of everyone that's not bare would be everyone registered for the course. Everyone on the basketball team is tall. So a bare everyone statement is the one that I uttered just a minute ago. Everyone is here. Okay, so on this unrestricted view of the domain of everyone, bare everyone statements are all false, basically. I mean, you could on some weird occasion. I guess here's the only time it could be true is if you said you're in a course on human evolution and you say everyone is descended from a universal common ancestor who lived in Africa ages so many millions of years ago. That would be like the only statement of everyone that would be true because it would include all of humanity. But basically every other use is false. So here's what contextualism or relativism says about everyone. Well, the literal meaning of everyone, not just the speaker meaning, but the literal meaning in the sentence of everyone is going to vary from context of use to context of use. Everyone, the bare everyone, in my assertion, everyone is here, meant something different than the use of everyone in the human evolution class or in other contexts. It changes meaning, the domain changes. The domain of objects that fall under that term change. It's contextually variable. And on this view, we wind up not saying falsehoods all the stinking time. We wind up speaking truthfully an awful lot of the time. I think this is a reason to go for a relativist interpretation of everyone. So very, very few people go with a non-relativist interpretation of everyone. People working in philosophy of language and linguistics think we've got to account for contextual variability in meaning. So in other words, there's relativism in domains concerning meaning in other places that you might not have known about. Quantifier, domain restriction, gradable adjectives like flat or tall. Relativism seems quite plausible there. And what I would like to argue further concerning relativism about ethics and epistemology is that the pattern that we've seen all the way from the uncharitable interpretation of Aristotle to the uncharitable colonial interpretations of it offered by these anthropologists, all the way through these more, what we saw about the skeptic a minute ago, and Unger on flatness and quantifier domain restriction, we just see a common pattern all the way through. It's the relativist. When it's a contest between a relativist and an invariantist, the relativist is on the side of the good historian or philosopher. The relativist is on the side of the anthropologist who says, no, I think Gavagai means any four-legged creature. The invariantist is on the side of the historian of philosophy who says, yeah, Aristotle just contradicts himself all the time. He wasn't so bright. The invariantist is on the side of the colonial anthropologist who says the natives use the term glavagai incorrectly all the time. And because there is this kind of pattern, that's a reason for thinking relativism isn't as far-fetched, as different, exotic, off the beaten path as you might have thought before you took this course. So I've argued that invariantist interpretations of flat and everyone are implausible. It's not plausible to think that that's what we really mean. I've argued that these interpretations are a lot like the colonial anthropologist interpretation of Gavagai as meaning rabbit. They each have it that people are using a word in a way to say something false basically all the time. That's implausible. It's weird. It's not charitable. And I want to highlight another respect in which this interpretation is less charitable. So, invariantist about flat and everyone, and actually like, as we'll see in a minute, a certain kind of invariantist about knowledge and morally right and morally wrong. The invariantist about flat and everyone thinks the meaning of these is the same, but there are norms governing warranted assertability that are contextually variable and shifting. It's totally, as I mentioned earlier, it's totally warranted to say this field is flat from one Frisbee team member to another, even though it's not really flat, according to Unger. So norms for warranted assertability, yeah, those are flexible. Those are relative, context-sensitive, contextually changing. Sure, absolutely. But people are confused or stupid or something misguided for thinking that the fact that they can sense that saying that's flat is a matter that changes across context. These people are confusing for thinking that the variations in assertability of that's flat have anything to do with the actual meaning of flat. It's got nothing to do with the meaning. I mean, the meaning is constant. Variations in assertability, not constant, meaning constant. And if you think variations in assertability have anything to do with meaning, you're confused and a little dumb. So, according to contextualism, contextualism agrees that the norms governing the assertability of that's flat, everyone is X, that these are contextually variable. But they also think that the meaning of flat and the meaning of everyone are contextually variable. And so when ordinary people think that contextual variability in assertability has something to do with what you mean, with what sentences actually mean, they're not actually stupid. They're right, actually. So it's charitable to ordinary speakers and thinkers, ordinary attributors of flatness, and speakers who talk about everyone. It's charitable to them because people seem to think that variations in assertability have something to do with meaning, literal meaning. And contextualism, relativism has them being right about this. Invariantism of Unger sort has them being wrong about this. But also, as you can perhaps begin to see, if you've not seen it already, there's a kind of theoretical virtue, an additional theoretical virtue, in addition to charity, that the relativist views have. There's this kind of things are in sync. This one thing that's contextually variable is in sync with this other thing, meaning, that's also contextually invariable. On the invariantist view, these important components are out of sync. And there's a kind of simplicity or elegance to a theory that has these parts being in sync. So let me just run through some of this very briefly. These particular statements right here you've heard me talk about before. But according to moral realists, folk relativists contradict themselves a lot. And something we didn't talk about so much is that according to the moral realists, a lot of moral judgments are going to be false. There's just one true set of moral norms. It doesn't vary across people, individual preferences, values, doesn't vary across cultures, doesn't vary across centuries. It's universal, unchanging. But people, as we know, make a diversity, a variety of moral judgments. Well, that means most of them are going to be false. Okay, so the moral realist winds up attributing a lot of falsity to people's moral judgments, just like the anthropologist who interprets Kavgai in a particular way. Contextualists, as I've argued before, are not confused for thinking relativism is objectively true. But something we didn't talk about quite as much is it's going to be more charitable by taking many, if not most, moral judgments to be true. So it's going to be in accord with the sensible interpretation of that field is flat and the sensible interpretation of everyone is here. It's going to attribute truth when anyone in their right mind is going to think those things are true. So there's different kinds of invariantism in epistemology. There's the skeptical invariantist, which Peter Unger defended, while also talking about his invariantism about flat. So these all appeared in the same works by Peter Unger. So all knowledge attributions concerning anyone's knowledge of the external world are false. That's Unger's view. Because we don't know anything. We know exactly zero about the external world. But people are warranted in asserting that, Jeff knows this, Sally knows that. Oh yeah, they're warranted. They're epistemically warranted in asserting those things. Absolutely, you betcha. Now, non-skeptical invariantists take a different tack. They think that the norms governing knowledge are constant as well across contexts. They just don't think they're constant and unmeetably high, unmeetably strict, like the skeptical invariantists. So they're going to say that many knowledge attributions are true. We know a lot of what we think we know. But like the skeptical invariantists, they think that people are seriously confused for thinking that variability in norms of assertability have anything to do with knowledge. So the non-skeptical invariantists writing in recent decades all agree that there is variability on assertability. In some contexts, when stakes are high, the epistemic norms, not just norms of politeness or connected to practical utility, but epistemic norms will vary depending upon whether you're in a high or a low stakes, or depending upon whether you're in an epistemology class discussing error possibilities involved in brain in a vat scenarios, or whether you're just at the bar. So non-skeptical invariantists agree that, yeah, the epistemic norms govern assertability vary, but that's got nothing to do. The actual truth of knowledge attributions and knowledge denials. And if you think the second has anything to do with the first, you're confused. So the contextual says you're not confused. This variability in the epistemic norms on assertability, which we can all sense. The claim is people aren't able to formulate a theory about the norms governing assertability, but they are sensitive to those norms nonetheless. They act in accordance with those norms as if they really they have an implicit knowledge of them. And people aren't confused for thinking that this variability in norms of assertion has something to do with whether you actually know or not. So anyway, relativists like epistemic contextualists are charitable in the sense of attributing truth a whole lot more often to our knowledge attributions and denials than any kind of invariantist, whether it's a skeptical or non-skeptical invariantist. And they're more charitable in thinking that we're not confused. So, so let's consider these two people we talked about last time. Someone says, "I know the bank will be open." This is, of course, DeRosa's bank case, first published in 1992. And this other person says, "I don't know the bank will be open." Okay. If the person on the left is in a low-stakes context and says, "Yes, I know the bank will be open," everybody, every one of these views listed in the leftmost column agrees with the warranted assertability row here. They all agree that, yes, it is warranted to assert, "I know the bank will be open," in the low stakes case. And everyone agrees it's warranted to assert what the woman on the right asserted in the high stakes case. She says, "I don't know it will be open. I'm in a high stakes situation. I don't know." Everyone, the skeptical invariantist, the non-skeptical invariantist, everybody agrees that's warrantedly assertable. Okay? And they're also going to agree about what's assertable in cases of salient error or not salient error. Well, you know, banks sometimes change their hours. That's making an error possibility salient by mentioning it. So the person on the left, where there's no salient error, no possibility of error has been mentioned, and this person says, "I know the bank will be open," yes, that's warrantedly assertable. When the person that was on the right says, "I don't know it will be open," in a situation where error possibilities have been made very salient, then glossing over a couple of niceties, everyone's going to agree that, yes, that's warrantedly assertable. That knowledge denial, "I don't know the bank will be open," that's the epistemically right thing to say. Okay? So now the question, now what I want to look at with model fit as the final thing here in the slide presentation is how well these views fit with warranted assertability. And I've already indicated some of what's going to, most of what's going to come be filled in here on the rest of this table in other slides. But it's good to sort of see it summarized in a very clear way like this. All right, so the skeptical invariantist says, "You never know anything." That's Peter Unger, defended skeptical invariantism. So in the low stakes case, the person says, "I know." Unger says, "False. You don't know anything." In the high stakes case where the person says, "I don't know," that's a case where Unger says, "True. Yeah, that's right. Your knowledge denial is true." That's because no one knows anything ever. Okay. And Unger's going to say something similar about the salient and non-salient error cases. When the person on the left says, "I know," and no error possibility has been made salient, Unger says, "False. You don't know. You don't know anything ever. Whether the error possibility has been made salient or not, you just never know." So in the rightmost column, remember, this is a person who's given a knowledge denial. They say, in the face of salient error possibility, they say, "I don't know." Because it's a knowledge denial, Unger smiles and says, "Yes, that's true." So the non-skeptical invariantist is going to give the opposite, assign the opposite truth values to what Peter Unger assigns. Because the non-skeptical invariantist thinks we always know stuff. If it's really true that the bank is going to be open, remember we're assuming objective truth there. And the person believes it just as confidently across all cases. And the only thing that varies is whether in a low or high stakes situation or whether an error possibility has been made salient or not. Then if you know, you always know across all four cases. Or if you don't know, you always don't know. But let's assume that the person has good evidence and it meets the sort of modest standards of the non-skeptical invariantist. We have two T's there for true in each of the two cases where the person says, "I know." The non-skeptical invariantist says, "Good job, that's the right thing to say." The two F's are in the cases where there are knowledge denials, and the woman on the right says, "I don't know." And the non-skeptical invariantist says, "That's false, you do." But here's the thing about the non-skeptical invariantist. The non-skeptical invariantist says, you are warranted in asserting that you don't know the bank will be open in a high-stakes situation. Epistemically, it was the right thing to assert that you don't know, but it's false that you don't know. So there's this mismatch between what the non-skeptical invariantist and any invariantist says about assertability and about truth. Now, the expressivist, which we're going to look at in a week or two, is going to say no proposition is going to be expressed in a knowledge attribution or denial, so there's just sort of no T or F to be assigned here. But note that there's still a mismatch between what you're warranted in asserting. The epistemic expressivist, I don't believe, is going to say that any old assertion is warrantedly assertable. It just so happens that the four assertions we're considering are all warrantedly assertable. But there's no possibility of these assertions matching up with any kind of truth value because there's just no truth value there. Okay, so finally, contextualism. Contextualism says it's true to say in the low-stakes situation that you know. It's true to say you don't know in the high-stakes situation. It's true to say in the no salient error case that you know. It's true to say in the salient error case that you don't know. So we've got true, 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 true. And with contextualism, we have the only view where there's a match between warranted assertability and contextualism. All other views require attributing a kind of cognitive confusion to agents, and they involve because people think like the top and the truth values and what's warrantedly assertable have something to do with each other. People think that. So these other views have to say they're confused about that somehow, and it's more charitable as well. Okay. Now, what I just did here in this slide is to leave the top row the same, warranted assertability, and then fill in a bunch of different views under contextualism. So we're going to talk about truth relativism. That's the label I'll use for John McFarland's view. DeRose talks about subject-sensitive invariantism, and this gets talked about along the way a little bit by Bagramian and maybe McFarland too. I can't remember off the top of my head. DeRose talks a little bit about some other view called contrastivism. Pragmatic encroachment comes up a tiny bit in DeRose's work. Doesn't matter what the three views represented by the lower three rows really are. What I would like to point out right now is just that Keith DeRose, primarily, but also secondarily, David Lewis, and then coming in as a sort of distant third, Stuart Cohen, all defended a kind of contextualism beginning around 1990-ish, 1990. And a lot of other views followed in the wake of contextualism. And the one point that I want to make with this slide is simply all of these other views, truth relativism, subject-sensitive invariantism, contrastivism, again, doesn't matter what these views are, they wanted to follow contextualism in making the truth value of knowledge attributions and denials match what's warrantedly assertable. So you see how all the T's match all the Y's. Okay? So people were very much convinced by that and thought that there's really something important about that. If we feel like the right thing to say now is I don't know, it would be good, other things being equal, if an epistemological theory could make your statement come out as true. Whereas if people overwhelmingly agree, not just one person, but like there's this consensus that it's the wrong thing to say in the situation that you know, that it's then other things being equal, it would be good if an epistemological theory made that a correct thing to think and say as well. As you can see with this view called pragmatic encroachment, which it doesn't have T's all the way across, but it's got a lot of T's. Something to note is that each of these views, I suppose every one of these, well, except for McFarland, subject-sensitive invariantism and contrastivism and pragmatic encroachment would not call themselves versions of relativism, And some people have said all of these views, every one of these from contextualism on down, some people have suggested let's call all these views some form of, well, no, that's not true either. There's a kind of variantism that each of these theories takes on, a kind of variability that a lot of theories think it's important to take account of. In any case, without mentioning what some of these other views are, subject-sensitive invariantism and so on, I just wanted to just sort of mention that relativism is actually, quite at home with a lot of other theories. Theories in philosophy of language and philosophical logic about quantifiers, every and everyone. It's actually quite at home with sensible interpretations and philosophical logic of universal quantifiers. It's actually quite at home with a lot of contemporary epistemological theories like, contrastivism and these other things, because they all think that accounting for variability in assertions that people make concerning knowledge are important to take into account and to charitably take into account. I wanted to go through this because, as I mentioned before, the basic education that a lot of philosophers get suggests that any kind of relativism is bad and weirdly bad. And it's actually not really the case, I think. You can still think it's false, that's fine. But it's very much at home. Okay, so to sum up, in a way that's not at all tendentious. Not at all tendentious. Invariantists, they're kind of like this guy, and contextualists, relativists are kind of like this guy. One is arrogant and has a superiority complex and attributes truth to all his statements and falsity to everybody else's. The other kind of person wants to be your neighbor and is nice as heck and doesn't think you're stupid and thinks that you say a lot of true things. Okay, so that's my not at all tendentious summary slide. Okay, thanks.